Well, thank you for that introduction, Sam, and I certainly want to welcome everyone to today's presentation because, unfortunately, debit card fraud is something that impacts every financial institution that offers the product, and the problem only seems to be getting worse. I did have the pleasure of speaking with a compliance officer from a financial institution that I visited not that long ago, and one of the frustrations that they expressed to me was that they had attended a presentation on this topic, and the presenter said, you know, fraud prevention is more of an art than a science. And she said that that had really turned her off because it seemed like, hey, there's nothing that she can really do other than some educated guesswork to try to stem the tide of fraudulent transactions. And while on the one hand I can appreciate that every financial institution is different, every card base is different, and so consequently what works for one institution may or may not work for another, at the same time, if we take a scientific approach or a procedural approach to addressing the problem, regardless of where our institution's at or the size of our institution, there are steps that we can take to mitigate the exposure that we have to debit card fraud. And that's really our focus here for today's program. In order to take those appropriate steps, the first thing we need to do is have a good understanding of what types of methods do the bad guys use. If we know what they're doing, we can better craft our defense against what's impacting our institution. It's also important to know what are our high-risk transactions. What are the types of debit card transactions that are most likely going to cause a financial loss for the institution? And then having a solid investigation program, and as well as knowing what our recovery options are, whether through Visa, MasterCard, whether through a good investigation process, can again help to, even if we receive those fraud claims from our customers, know that there are steps that we can take to avoid losses in certain situations. And of course, an ounce of prevention, as the good doctor would say. Again, having defenses in place to try to stop fraud before it even happens. Again, a great way to minimize the impact to our bottom line. Definitely want to take a 5-minute break in the middle. I know it can be a lengthy 2 hours, and we all have busy jobs that we need to get to, so we'll make sure to do that for you as well. Just again, as Sam had mentioned, I will be referring to the presentation notes throughout today, and you've kind of got some homework that I've left for you within those presentation notes. A lot of the stories and reference material that I utilized in preparing today's session, I've left links for you so that you can go to the actual web story and read for yourself a little bit about what's taken place, some of the background that's affected other institutions. And again, under that prevention option, one of the great things that an institution can do is stay abreast of what's going on in the industry. Because if you're familiar with the techniques the crooks are using, if you interact with other institutions and find out what they're doing to prevent fraud, this can really be a collaborative effort for all institutions to stand up and say, hey, we're tired of taking these losses. What can we do to stop it? So to begin, we want to look at some statistics. And again, they're just black and white numbers, but what we can glean from them may help us to, again, identify where are we most vulnerable, where should we be focusing the limited resources that we have in order to try to limit our losses. So the CFPB, in analyzing whether or not Reg II should have that penny fraud adjustment to the interchange income, they rely on a survey that's conducted by the Federal Reserve every couple of years looking at fraud statistics. And what those statistics found were that 82% of all signature-based fraud losses are attributed to signature-based debit card purchases. And so that's where the crook, all they have to do is sign a card or swipe a card, sign a bogus name, and they make off with the funds. The remaining 18% was attributed to PIN-based purchases. And so, therefore, it's very clear that the overwhelming majority of fraud does not involve PIN number. And that's important for when crafting a fraud strategy to know, should we be trying to craft our strategy to prevent PIN-based fraud because we always lose those transactions, or should we be focusing on signature-based fraud because that's where the bulk of the transactions that are hitting us are coming from? The survey went on to compare bank losses versus merchant losses, and it noted that in 62% of the time, the online losses were being, 38% of the overall losses were to the merchant, and 62% of the losses were to the bank. So unfortunately, the bank is losing the majority of the time when there is a disputed debit card transaction. What the study did find was that almost all of the merchant losses can be attributed to card not present or non-face-to-face transactions. And so the bank will lose in the instances where the card is present, so if it's counterfeit, lost, or stolen, and the merchant was losing on the bulk of those online purchases. So there again, the institution can craft its defenses to maybe target that card-present activity because that's where you're losing the bulk of the time. Now, before we get too much into the technological side of debit card fraud, a lot of institutions I find will overlook the non-technological means of cards being compromised or stolen. The first is just the basic shoulder surfer, and I consider this fraud before computers because this has certainly been going on for a long time. So a shoulder surfer, you have the customer who uses their ATM at a PIN pad at a merchant location or at an ATM, and then the next person in line is kind of leaning over to get a little glimpse of the PIN as it's being entered. And in your materials, I was having some fun with Microsoft Clip Art, and so I've provided some visual aids to try to illustrate what's taken place. And so in the picture that we have in our materials, you've got a man in line innocently checking his watch behind someone who's using the ATM, but he could be actually glancing down at the PIN pad. And so for this reason, many ATMs and store PIN pads now come with a protective covering to try to shield the pad from view. And again, this may seem like a relatively low-tech crime, but particularly in our urban areas, we do have some pretty organized rings that use this as a method to steal several cards. We've had instances where you have customers who are going to nightclubs, other drinking establishments that have ATMs on premises, and maybe they've had a few too many, but they're going back to the ATM anyway. And so they will have one person standing behind them to capture the PIN, and the next person who they come up to happens to be the pickpocket who bumps into them, gets a hold of the wallet, and now they've got the card and the PIN and can drain the bank account. So it's not too difficult for a group of two individuals to work a room and make off with quite a significant amount of cards in a single evening. Similarly, you've got the purse snatcher. Again, you have a woman shopping, not securing her purse. Maybe it's in the front portion of the cart, looks away, and before you know it, your purse is gone. And we had an institution with a situation where thankfully they had a fraud monitoring service in place because their customer was contacted by the fraud monitoring service to ask, hey, did you try a $900 purchase at Target? And she said, well, no, I sure didn't. And as it turned out, it was then that she realized that her purse was missing. She was in Target at the time, so the crooks stole her purse and tried to use it in the same store that they had just taken it from. And so that'll give you an idea of the speed at which these folks operate, because they know that as soon as the card's discovered missing, the bank's going to be shutting it down, and so they act very quickly to try to steal the funds before either the bank or the customer is aware. Unfortunately, it can still happen where you have a member of organized crime get a job as an employee that has access to debit card information, And then their sole task is to harvest as many card numbers as possible, and then